Welcome back to DreamScrolls, where epic gaming lore meets peaceful rest. Tonight, we journey deep into the lands between to explore one of the most heartrending aspects of Elden Ring's mythology, the tragic fates of the Demigods. Over the next few hours, we'll uncover the sorrowful destinies of Queen Marika's children and descendants, from the Golden Prince who became death itself to the cursed twins who embodied both divine potential and cosmic suffering. So settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin this melancholic adventure together. In the shadow of the great Erd Tree, where golden light once promised eternal order, stands a family broken by curses, ambition, and the crushing weight of divine blood. These are the Demigods, children and descendants of Queen Marika the Eternal, each bearing within them both the blessing and burden of their godly heritage. Their stories are not tales of triumph but chronicles of suffering, sacrifice, and the inexorable march toward doom that seems to follow all who dare reach for divinity. What makes the Demigods' stories so profoundly tragic is not simply that they suffered or failed, but that their very nature as divine beings made their suffering inevitable. From the moment of their births, they were pawns in cosmic games played by forces far greater than themselves, destined to either ascend to godhood or fall as sacrifices upon the altar of ambition. The power that flowed through their veins, which should have been a gift, became instead a curse that amplified every flaw, intensified every struggle, and guaranteed that their personal pain would ripple outward to consume entire regions and countless innocent lives. To understand the tragedy of the Demigods, we must first comprehend what it means to be born of divine blood in the lands between. These beings, blessed with power beyond mortal comprehension, were also cursed with fates that no amount of strength could alter. They existed as living contradictions, too human to be truly divine, yet too divine to ever be simply human. This liminal existence created psychological wounds that no magic could heal and burdens that no hero could bear. The Demigods exist in three primary lineages, each marked by its own particular brand of sorrow. First, the Golden lineage, born of Queen Marika and her first consort, Godfrey the First Elden Lord. These children bore the pure gold of the Erd Tree in their veins, yet even this blessing became a curse when the golden order they represented began to crumble. They were meant to be perfect embodiments of divine rule, but perfection itself became their prison. Second, the Carian bloodline, born of the union between Radahn and Ranni, Queen of the Full Moon. These children straddled two worlds, caught between the cosmic order of the stars and the earthly dominion of gold. Their dual heritage granted them incredible magical abilities but also created internal conflicts that tore at their very sense of identity. They belonged fully to neither tradition, forever caught between competing loyalties and incompatible philosophies. And finally, the twin prodigies born of Marika and Radagon's union, a union that was revealed to be one being merged with itself. These children, despite their incredible potential, or perhaps because of it, suffered the most terrible curses of all. They represented the pinnacle of what divine blood could achieve, and thus bore the heaviest burdens that cosmic forces could impose. Each lineage tells a different story of how divine blood can become both gift and poison, how the very qualities that make one special can also ensure their destruction. The Golden lineage would know the pain of being cast aside when their purpose was fulfilled. The Carian children would face the agony of divided loyalties and the corruption of their noble ideals. And the twins would bear curses so profound that they would spend their entire existence fighting against their own nature. The tragedy begins with understanding that these demigods, despite their power, were never truly free. From birth, they were bound by the expectations of their divine mother, by the machinations of outer gods, and by the inexorable weight of destiny itself. Queen Marika's own words echo through eternity like a death sentence. Hear me, demigods. My children beloved, make of thyselves that which ye desire, be it a lord, be it a god, but should ye fail to become aught at all, ye will be forsaken. This maternal decree was not encouragement but ultimatum. It set her children upon a path where only perfection would suffice, where any failure to achieve the impossible would result in abandonment and destruction. It was a command that would drive some to madness, others to desperate measures, and all of them toward the very fates they sought to avoid. In demanding that her children become gods, Marika ensured that they would suffer as only gods can suffer, bearing the weight of worlds upon shoulders that, despite their divine strength, remained fundamentally finite. The Demigods' stories are tales of how love can become obsession, how duty can become prison, how strength can become vulnerability, and how the pursuit of godhood can strip away everything that makes existence worthwhile. They are cautionary tales about the price of power, the poison of ambition, and the fundamental impossibility of satisfying the demands placed upon those born to divine purpose. As we journey through each of their stories tonight, we'll see how curses both literal and metaphorical shape their destinies. We'll witness how family bonds, which should have been sources of strength and comfort, instead became weapons turned against them. We'll understand how the very cosmic order they were born to uphold became the instrument of their destruction. And we'll come to recognize that the true tragedy of the demigods lies not in their defeats, but in the fact that their suffering served no redemptive purpose, that their pain, however profound, could never purchase the love, acceptance, or meaning they so desperately sought. The lands between bear the scars of their struggles even now. Regions lie in ruin. Populations are scattered or transformed, and the very fabric of reality has been torn by their conflicts. But perhaps the deepest scars are not visible in the landscape, but written in the empty thrones and abandoned palaces that dot the realm, silent monuments to dreams that could never be realized, to potential that could never be fulfilled, and to children who, despite their divine blood, needed nothing more than what any child needs, to be loved for who they are rather than what they might become. Tonight, we honor their memory not by celebrating their power or mourning their failures, but by bearing witness to their humanity. For in the end, that is what makes their stories so profoundly tragic, that beneath the divine blood and cosmic curses, these were beings who felt pain, who yearned for connection, who struggled with doubt and fear, and who faced their dooms with a courage that their suffering makes all the more heartbreaking. Let us begin with the firstborn, the golden prince who should have inherited everything, but instead became the harbinger of a new and terrible age. At the head of the golden lineage stands Godwyn the Golden, firstborn son of Queen Marika and Godfrey, and perhaps the most tragic figure in all of Elden Ring's mythology. Godwyn was everything a divine prince should be: noble, brave, beloved by his subjects, and possessed of power that could bend even the mightiest dragons to his will. He was the golden child in every sense, unmarked by curse or corruption, a being of such purity that even his enemies respected him. Yet it was precisely this perfection that made his fate so devastating. Godwyn's early life reads like a heroic legend, the kind of tale that minstrels would sing for generations. When the ancient dragons assaulted the capital of Leyndell, it was Godwyn who led the defense. The young prince faced down Fortisax, one of the most powerful ancient dragons, in single combat. But rather than simply defeating his foe through superior strength, Godwyn did something remarkable, something that would define his character and, tragically, contribute to his eventual doom. He befriended the great dragon. This act of compassion and strength not only ended the dragon war, but established the ancient dragon cult within Leyndell, allowing knights to learn the power of lightning itself. This friendship between prince and dragon would prove prophetic, for it demonstrated Godwyn's greatest strength, his ability to transform enemies into allies, to find peace where others saw only conflict. He was beloved not just by his human subjects but by creatures that had been mortal enemies of his kind. In him, the Golden Order found its perfect representative, a being who could embody the best aspects of divine rule without falling into the typical traps of pride and tyranny. Godwyn's court was a place of learning and culture. Scholars gathered to study under his patronage, knights trained in both martial prowess and honorable conduct, and common folk found justice and protection under his benevolent rule. He married and had children, extending the golden lineage further. He participated in the governance of the realm with wisdom beyond his years, tempering his mother's sometimes harsh decrees with mercy and understanding. Everything about him suggested a future where the Golden Order would reach its highest expression, where divine rule would truly serve the needs of all who lived beneath the Erdtree's light. Yet it was precisely this perfection that made Godwyn the perfect target for those who sought to disrupt the cosmic order. His nobility and trustworthiness, which should have been sources of strength, became weaknesses that enemies could exploit. The assassination that would claim his soul was successful precisely because he was incapable of imagining that someone would violate the fundamental bonds of family and divine order to achieve political goals. The Night of Black Knives was orchestrated by his stepsister, Ranni the Witch, who sought to free herself from the chains of destiny. The details of her conspiracy remain shrouded in mystery, but what we know suggests she stole a fragment of the Rune of Death from Malekith, the Black Blade. Her plan appears to have been as clever as it was cruel. She needed to die in body while preserving her soul, and the cosmic balance seemingly demanded a price. If she were to die in flesh, someone else would have to die in spirit. Why she chose Godwyn remains a matter of interpretation. Perhaps because he was the most beloved, perhaps because his death would cause the greatest upheaval, or perhaps for reasons we can only guess at. The choice reveals much about the nature of cosmic forces in the lands between that innocence provides no protection, that virtue guarantees no safety, and that the best among us often bear the heaviest burdens. The Black Knife assassins, all of them Numen women, sharing Queen Marika's own race, crept into the capital and found Godwyn beneath the royal palace. Their blades, imbued with the power of destined death, carved half of the curse mark of death into his back, while Ranni simultaneously carved the other half into her own body. In that moment, both died and both lived, but in the worst possible ways imaginable. Godwyn's body survived while his soul perished completely, leaving behind a hollow shell that could not truly live but could not truly die. Ranni's soul lived on while her body died, allowing her to escape into the realm of spirits and dolls. The curse mark of death, meant to be a complete circle representing true death, was instead split into 2 crescent moons, creating a perversion of the natural order that would haunt the lands between for ages to come. The moment of Godwyn's spiritual death would have been one of confusion and terror, to feel one's very essence being carved away while the body remains behind. It is a fate that defies comprehension, leaving behind something that could still exist in some terrible half-state that went against all natural law. What happened to Godwyn after his spiritual death represents one of the most horrifying transformations in all of fantasy literature. Without a soul to guide it, his body began to change in ways that defied both nature and reason. The Golden Prince, once the most beautiful and noble of all demigods, became the Prince of Death, a massive, grotesque creature with fish-like features, scaled skin, and dead eyes that reflected nothing but the void where his soul once dwelt. The transformation was not instantaneous but gradual, a slow descent into corruption that made it all the more horrific. His golden hair darkened and fell away. His noble features stretched and distorted. His skin took on a sickly pallor before erupting in scales and growths that bore no resemblance to anything living. The body that had once moved with grace and purpose now sprawled in ungainly masses, growing without direction or limit, spreading like some terrible fungus through the roots beneath the capital. But the horror of Godwyn's transformation extended far beyond his own suffering. When his body was given the honor of tree burial and laid to rest among the roots of the Erd tree itself, the corruption of his deathless state began to spread. The tree roots, once pure conduits of the Erd tree's grace, became infected with what scholars call deathroot, a spreading corruption that gave rise to those who live in death. These undead beings, neither truly alive nor properly deceased, began to proliferate throughout the lands between. Skeletons that should have crumbled to dust instead wandered with malevolent purpose. Spirits that should have passed on to whatever lies beyond became trapped in an endless cycle of pain and confusion. The very concept of death, once cleanly defined by the Golden Order, became muddied and terrible. The spread of Godwyn's corruption can be tracked across the entire realm. In the catacombs and dungeons that honeycomb the underground, skeletal warriors rise again and again, animated by the deathless energy that radiates from his remains. In graveyards and burial grounds, spirits manifest in agony, unable to pass on, unable to rest. Even the Erd tree itself shows signs of the infection, its roots growing dark and diseased where they come into contact with the Prince of Death's spreading form. Even Fortisax, the ancient dragon who had been Godwyn's dear friend and companion, was not spared from this spreading corruption. The great dragon entered Godwyn's deathbed dream, seemingly attempting to burn away the death within his friend's body with purifying lightning. But the corruption proved too strong, too fundamental. Instead of saving Godwyn, Fortisax himself became infected, transforming from a majestic ancient dragon into a lich dragon, forever bound to the realm of death and decay. The image of Fortisax, still fighting within the deathbed dream to save his friend even as his own body rots away, stands as one of the most poignant symbols of loyalty in the entire tale. Here was a creature who had once been Godwyn's enemy, who had been won over by the prince's nobility and compassion, now sacrificing everything in what appears to have been a futile attempt to reverse what could not be reversed. The dragon's continuing battle within Godwyn's deathbed dream suggests the stubborn refusal to accept the unacceptable, the determination to keep fighting even when all hope seems lost. The tragedy deepened when those who loved Godwyn refused to accept his fate. Miquella, his younger half-brother, worked with the Knights of Castle Sol to create an eclipse they believed might restore Godwyn's soul to his body. They poured resources and lives into this desperate hope, conducting rituals that pushed the boundaries of known magic. But their efforts appear to have been doomed from the start. The soul that had been destroyed could not be recovered, and their failure likely added to the mounting despair that would eventually affect the Haligtree as well. The Death Knights, Godwyn's most loyal followers, made perhaps the most tragic choice of all. Rather than abandon their lord in his corruption, they chose to follow him into his new existence as the Prince of Death. These noble warriors deliberately embraced the very corruption that others fled from, becoming undead knights in service to their transformed master. They traded their lives, their humanity, and their hope of rest for the chance to remain loyal to the prince they had served in life, or so it appears from the evidence we find scattered throughout the lands between. One can imagine the psychological journey these knights underwent in making this decision. They watched their beloved lord transform into something monstrous. They saw the corruption spread and understood its terrible nature. Yet they chose to embrace it, to allow it to consume them, because the alternative, abandoning Godwyn to his fate, seemed unthinkable. Their loyalty transcended reason, transcended self-preservation, transcended even the natural human fear of death and corruption. As the corruption spread, it became clear that Godwyn's death had achieved something terrible that no victory in life could have accomplished. It had broken the fundamental order of existence itself. Death, which had been cleanly removed from the world by Queen Marika's initial reforms, had returned in a form more horrible than its original state. Now, instead of the peace of true death, the lands between knew only the agony of endless undeath. The political ramifications of Godwyn's death were equally catastrophic. The Golden Prince, who had been groomed to eventually succeed to power, who represented stability and continuity, was gone. The succession became unclear. The family bonds that had held the Demigods together, however tenuously, were shattered by this act of betrayal from within. Marika herself was driven to grief so profound that she shattered the Elden Ring, setting in motion the wars that would tear the realm apart. The Golden Prince, who had once been the perfect embodiment of divine rule, had become the perfect embodiment of divine failure. His transformation served as a constant reminder that even the purest of intentions, even the most noble of souls, could be twisted into something monstrous by forces beyond their control. In trying to cheat death, the cosmic powers had created something far worse than death itself. Godwyn's body still lies beneath the capital, sprawled through the roots like some terrible cancer. Pilgrims can find his face, massive and distorted, staring with dead eyes at nothing. The sight is one of supreme sadness. Here was beauty and nobility reduced to horror. Here was the promise of the Golden Age transformed into the herald of an age of death and decay. The ultimate tragedy of Godwyn is that he did nothing to deserve his fate. He made no bargain with dark powers. He committed no sin that required cosmic punishment. He was guilty only of being perfect, of being beloved, of being the one whose death would matter most. In a world where curses and doom seem reserved for the wicked or the foolish, Godwyn's fate reminds us that sometimes tragedy strikes the innocent for no reason other than that their suffering serves someone else's purpose. His story represents the ultimate tragedy of the demigods, that their very nature as divine beings made them vulnerable to corruptions and curses that mortals could never imagine. His fall from Golden Prince to Prince of Death is not just a personal tragedy but a cosmic one, representing the moment when the ordered universe of the Golden Order began its inevitable collapse into chaos and despair. And perhaps the cruelest aspect of all is that Godwyn, unlike his siblings who would suffer and struggle and make choices both noble and terrible, had no agency in his own doom. He was murdered in his sleep, his soul destroyed before he even knew he was under attack. He never had the chance to fight, to choose, to even understand what was happening to him. His tragedy is the tragedy of the innocent victim, made all the more terrible by the corruption that followed, for even in death, even without a soul, his suffering continues to spread, consuming everything it touches. Moving deeper into the golden lineage, we encounter the Omen twins, Morgott and Mohg, whose very existence challenged the Golden Order's pretense of purity and perfection. Born to Queen Marika and Godfrey as second and third sons, these children were cursed from the moment of their birth with the mark of the Omen, a condition that covered their bodies with horns and other growths that the Golden Order considered abominable. Their story is one of rejection, twisted loyalty, and the radically different paths that two people subjected to identical trauma can take. The tragedy of Morgott and Mohg begins with understanding what it meant to be Omen in the lands between. These beings were seen as cursed, their horn-covered bodies viewed as evidence of corruption and divine displeasure. The official doctrine taught that Omens were touched by some ancient evil, their very existence a challenge to the ordered perfection that the Golden Order claimed to represent. Evidence throughout the lands between suggests their horns and other features were likely remnants of the Crucible, the primordial state of life that existed before the current order imposed its rigid structure upon the world. Rather than celebrate these children as links to the world's ancient past, Queen Marika chose to hide them away. The decision reveals much about her character and priorities. She valued appearance and political necessity over the well-being of her own children. Morgott and Mohg were secreted beneath the capital city of Lendel, confined to the sewers and forgotten tunnels that lay far from the golden light of the Erd Tree. They were not merely neglected but actively hidden, as if their existence were a shameful secret that could undermine the Golden Order's claims of divine favor. This decision, born of shame and political necessity, would shape both brothers in ways that would echo through the ages. The psychological impact of this abandonment cannot be overstated. These were not merely cast-aside nobles, but the direct sons of a goddess and an Elden Lord, beings whose blood should have guaranteed them places of honor and respect. Instead, they grew up in darkness, surrounded by filth and shadow, knowing that their own mother considered them too shameful to acknowledge publicly. Imagine the childhood of these princes, born to royalty but raised among refuse, possessed of divine blood but treated as monsters. They would have heard, perhaps through servants or guards, tales of their golden half-brother Godwyn being celebrated in the light above while they languished in darkness below. They would have understood that the only difference between his fate and theirs was the appearance of their bodies, that they were being punished not for any action or choice, but simply for how they were born. Yet even in their abandonment, the two brothers chose radically different paths, each representing a different response to the trauma of rejection. Their divergence offers a profound meditation on how identical circumstances can produce opposite reactions, how the same wound can drive one person toward desperate loyalty and another toward vengeful rebellion. Morgott, despite every reason to hate the Golden Order that had cast him aside, became its most devoted defender. In what appears to be a case of identification with his oppressor, he internalized the very prejudices that had been used to justify his exile. He came to believe that his curse made him unworthy of love or acceptance, but that this unworthiness should drive him to serve rather than rebel. His loyalty was not despite his rejection, but because of it, he sought to prove his worth through service, to earn the acceptance that should have been his birthright. This psychological pattern is deeply tragic because it requires Morgott to participate in his own oppression. He accepts the Golden Order's judgment that omens are lesser beings, even though he himself is omen. He enforces laws and standards that declare him unfit to rule, even as he takes on the responsibilities of rule. He defends a system that would cast him back into the sewers if his true identity were known, using an alias Morgott, the fell omen, to hide who he truly is. Morgott's story is perhaps the more heartbreaking of the two because of this fundamental irony. When the Shattering occurred and various demigods began fighting over the fragments of the Elden Ring, it was Morgott who emerged from the sewers to defend the capital and the Erdtree itself. He did not do this for personal gain or recognition. Morgott never claimed the throne for himself, never demanded acknowledgement of his royal blood. Instead, he fought because he genuinely believed in the Golden Order's mission, even knowing that it would never truly accept him. Under his alias, Morgott defended the Erdtree against all who would approach it without proper authorization. He faced down other demigods, including his own siblings, viewing their attempts to claim the throne as acts of treachery against the proper order. In his mind, he was the sole remaining guardian of legitimacy in a world gone mad with ambition. He became the protector of a system that had branded him as unworthy of protection. The cruelest aspect of Morgott's devotion was that it was built upon a foundation of self-hatred. He believed himself to be cursed and unworthy, accepting the Golden Order's judgment of his nature, even as he fought to preserve it. This internalized shame manifested in his inability to see his own worth, his refusal to claim the recognition he had earned through his service, and his treatment of other cursed beings with the same harsh judgment that had been applied to him. His weapon of choice is telling: the cursed sword, a blade that manifests from his own blood and conviction. It is literally forged from his curse, from his shame, from his determination to turn even his perceived weakness into a tool of service. Every time he draws this weapon, he is reminded of what he is and what he believes that makes him. Yet he wields it not in anger but in duty, channeling his pain into the defense of the order that caused it. When the Tarnished finally faces Morgott in his throne room, sitting in the seat he will not claim for himself, the king's dying words reveal the depth of his tragic self-deception. Even in death, he cannot bring himself to curse the order that had rejected him. Instead, he laments that he was not worthy to be its true guardian. His loyalty remained absolute even as his life ebbed away, a testament to the psychological damage inflicted by a lifetime of conditional love and systematic devaluation. "We are all forsaken," he whispers, grouping himself with the Tarnished and others who have been cast out. Even in his final moments, he sees himself as one of the rejected, never understanding that he had proven his worth 1,000 times over, that his loyalty and strength had made him more valuable to the Golden Order than any of the siblings who bore no curse. He dies believing he failed, when in truth it was the Golden Order that failed him. Mohg's path, while more obviously destructive, represents an equally tragic response to the same fundamental rejection. Where Morgott internalized the Golden Order's judgment and sought to prove his worth through service, Mohg externalized his pain and sought to build something new from the ruins of his shattered self-worth. If the Golden Order would not accept him, then he would find other gods to serve, other forms of power to pursue. His alliance with the Formless Mother provided him with the power and purpose that the Golden Order had denied him. This outer god, associated with blood and formless life, offered Mohg something seductive, the promise that his curse, his difference, could be transformed from weakness into strength. The blood magic he learned was intimately connected to wounds and suffering, themes that resonated deeply with someone who had spent his entire life wounded and suffering. Mohg created his own realm beneath the earth, the Mohgwyn Palace, a twisted reflection of the golden capital that had rejected him. In this underground kingdom, omens and other outcasts could find a place of belonging, but only under the dominion of a being whose own trauma had made him incapable of healthy relationships. The dynasty he built was founded on the same hierarchies and oppressions he had suffered under, merely inverted. Now those marked by blood were elevated, while the pure were denigrated. The blood rituals that formed the core of Mohgwyn's religious practices were simultaneously empowering and destructive. Followers gained strength through blood, achieved transformation through sacrifice, and found community through shared participation in something the outside world considered abhorrent. Yet these same rituals trap them in cycles of increasing dependence and degradation, binding them to Mohg through the literal sharing of blood that connected them to his cursed lineage. The most disturbing aspect of Mohg's story involves his obsession with his half-brother, Miquella. Perhaps seeing in the eternally youthful Empyrean a chance to claim the divine acceptance that had always been denied to him, Mohg kidnapped the slumbering Miquella and brought him to his palace. What happened there remains somewhat unclear, but Mohg appears to have attempted to transform Miquella into a god through blood rituals. This grotesque fixation, carried out upon an unconscious victim, represents the ultimate corruption of Mohg's capacity for love and connection. Mohg's actions toward Miquella can be understood as a desperate attempt to force the recognition and acceptance he had never received naturally. By attempting to elevate Miquella to godhood and positioning himself as that god's consort, he hoped to finally achieve the status and acknowledgement that his royal blood should have granted him from birth. Yet this plan appears to have been doomed from the start, built as it was upon violence, violation, and the fundamental misunderstanding that forced devotion could ever be real or satisfying. The relationship between Mohg and Miquella reveals the depths of Mohg's psychological damage. He claims to love Miquella, to be ushering in an age where all are welcomed and blessed. Yet his love is possessive, controlling, and fundamentally one-sided. Miquella remains unconscious throughout, never consenting, never participating, merely serving as a blank canvas onto which Mohg projects his fantasies of acceptance and belonging. The blood dynasty that Mohg created in the depths of his underground realm became a mirror of his own psychological state. It was a place where power was exercised through pain, where loyalty was maintained through fear and blood oaths, and where the wounds of the past were perpetually reopened rather than allowed to heal. His followers, drawn from among society's outcasts and rejects, found in him a leader who understood their pain, but who could offer them only more pain in return. The sanguine nobles who serve Mohg represent the most successful products of his transformation rituals, beings who have gained power and status within the blood dynasty, but at the cost of their essential humanity. They are elegant and sophisticated, speaking of their lord's dynasty with religious fervor, yet they are fundamentally trapped, unable to exist outside the system that has remade them. The ultimate tragedy of both Omen twins lies in the waste of their potential. Morgott possessed the strength and wisdom to rule justly, as evidenced by his successful defense of Lendel and his ability to see through the pretensions of other claimants to the throne. Mohg demonstrated incredible magical aptitude and organizational skills in creating his underground dynasty. Either brother could have been a force for positive change in the lands between. But the Golden Order's rejection had so thoroughly warped their self-perception that they could only exist in relation to the system that had hurt them. Morgott defined himself by his service to the order that rejected him. Mohg defined himself by his opposition to it. Neither could step outside the framework of rejection and acceptance, worthiness and unworthiness that had been imposed upon them from birth. Their stories serve as a damning indictment of the Golden Order's claims to righteousness and perfection. A truly just system would have found ways to accommodate and celebrate the diversity represented by Omen children, recognizing their unique gifts rather than simply casting them aside. Instead, by treating these divine-blooded princes as shameful secrets, the Golden Order created two of its most consequential figures, one who defended it out of twisted loyalty, and one who sought to overthrow it out of well-earned hatred. The parallel nature of their tragedies invites comparison and reflection. Two children, born of the same parents, subjected to identical treatment, yet producing completely opposite responses. Morgott turned his anger inward, becoming the perfect servant, while Mohg turned his anger outward, becoming the perfect rebel. Yet both were trapped by the same fundamental wound, the knowledge that they were not wanted, that their very existence was considered a problem to be solved rather than a life to be celebrated. In the end, both brothers die fighting for causes that could never fulfill them. Morgott dies defending an order that never truly accepted him, his final words expressing the same self-doubt that had plagued him all his life. Mohg dies clutching at his fantasy of dynasty and divinity, his unconscious god consort unable to validate the love and acceptance he so desperately sought. Their parallel deaths represent not just the end of two lives, but the final proof that no amount of service or rebellion could heal the fundamental wound of rejection they had carried since childhood. The final member of Godfrey's line deserving mention is Godrick the Grafted, though his blood connection to the divine lineage had become so diluted over the generations that he could barely claim legitimacy as a demigod at all. Godrick represents the endpoint of a noble bloodline's decay, showing how divine heritage can become a burden rather than a blessing when it is no longer sufficient to meet the expectations it creates. His tragedy is not one of nobility corrupted but of inadequacy, desperately masked through increasingly grotesque means. Godrick's tragedy lies in his acute awareness of his own inadequacy. As a distant descendant of Godwyn the Golden, he bore a name and heritage that promised greatness, but lacked the power to live up to those promises. This mismatch between expectation and reality drove him to increasingly desperate measures, culminating in his practice of grafting, the surgical attachment of limbs and organs from other beings onto his own body in a futile attempt to literally acquire the strength he had not inherited naturally. The practice of grafting represents one of the most visceral expressions of self-hatred in all of Elden Ring's lore. Unable to accept his limitations or find alternative sources of worth, Godrick chose to mutilate himself repeatedly, adding pieces of others to his body in the hope that quantity might somehow compensate for quality. Each new limb grafted onto his form was both an admission of inadequacy and a desperate grasp for relevance. Imagine the psychological state required to repeatedly undergo such procedures. Godrick would have to look at his own body and declare it insufficient, unworthy, incomplete. Then he would have to identify which parts of others he envied or desired, have those parts violently removed from their original owners, and surgically attached to himself. The physical pain of such procedures would be immense, but the psychological pain of constantly declaring oneself inadequate would be even greater. His political and military failures only compounded his psychological struggles. During the Shattering, Godrick lost battle after battle, suffering humiliating defeats at the hands of other demigods, including Malenia and Morgott. These losses, rather than teaching him humility or encouraging him to find different paths to meaning, only drove him to more extreme measures. He began grafting not just willing volunteers but unwilling victims, turning his court into a charnel house of surgical horror. The grotesque irony of Godrick's situation was that his very attempts to gain strength made him weaker. Each new graft required energy to maintain, created new vulnerabilities, and further removed him from any coherent sense of self. He became a living patchwork, a creature defined not by what he was, but by what he had taken from others. In trying to become everything, he became nothing, a shambling collection of parts with no unifying identity. His castle became a reflection of his internal state. Stormvale Castle, once a proud fortress, became a place of horror where Godrick's soldiers rounded up refugees and prisoners to serve as raw material for their lord's obsession. The halls that should have echoed with courtly life instead rang with screams and the sounds of surgical implements. The throne room where great decisions should have been made became an operating theatre where Godrick continuously remade himself in futile attempts to achieve the greatness that eluded him. The soldiers and followers who served Godrick represent their own form of tragedy. Many were likely drawn to him by genuine loyalty to the golden lineage, believing that any descendant of Godfrey deserved their service. What they found instead was a lord so consumed by his own inadequacy that he would sacrifice them piece by piece to maintain his delusions of grandeur. Yet many remained, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of a misplaced sense of duty, perhaps simply because they had nowhere else to go. When the Tarnished finally faces Godrick in his castle, they encounter not a mighty demigod but a pathetic creature so desperate for validation that he resorts to grafting a dragon head onto his own arm in the middle of their battle. This final act of self-mutilation, performed in full view of his enemy, represents the complete breakdown of whatever dignity or self-respect he might once have possessed. He is literally adding parts mid-battle, as if one more graft might finally be enough to bridge the gap between what he is and what he needs to be. His dying words carry no profound insight, no tragic recognition of his folly, no redemption through final understanding. He simply refuses to believe that a lowly tarnished could defeat one of the golden lineage, unable to accept even in death that his heritage meant nothing without the strength to back it up. Godrick dies as he lived grasping desperately for power that was never meant for him, unable to understand that his true tragedy lay not in his weakness, but in his inability to accept and work within his limitations. Godrick's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of measuring one's worth entirely in comparison to the achievements of one's ancestors. He was trapped by the weight of a legacy he could never fulfill, driven to self-destruction by the gap between who he was and who he thought he should be. Unlike his more powerful relatives whose tragedies stemmed from cosmic forces and divine curses, Godrick's tragedy was fundamentally human, the universal pain of inadequacy, amplified to monstrous proportions by his desperate refusal to accept reality. In the end, Godrick represents the logical conclusion of a society that values bloodline over merit, heritage over achievement, ancestry over individual worth. He was created by a system that told him he should be great simply because of who his ancestors were, then provided him no actual tools or abilities to achieve that greatness. His response, to literally steal greatness piece by piece from others, is simultaneously pathetic and understandable, a grotesque reflection of the impossible position he found himself in. The Carian bloodline presents a different but equally tragic set of stories. Born from the union of Radahn and Queen Marika, these children found themselves caught between two worlds, the mystical realm of lunar sorcery and cosmic observation that their mother represented, and the golden order of earthly dominion that their father served. This divided heritage would prove to be both a source of great power and the foundation of great suffering for all three of Ranni's children. Ranni the Witch, the eldest and perhaps most complex of the Carian children, represents the demigod who chose to reject divinity itself rather than accept the constraints it imposed. Born as lunar princess Ranni, she was marked as an Empyrean, one of the few beings capable of succeeding Queen Marika as a vessel for the Elden Ring and the god it contained. Yet rather than seeing this as a blessing, Ranni understood it as a sentence to eternal servitude to cosmic forces beyond her control. The tragedy of Ranni's situation was that her very potential for greatness made her a prisoner. As an Empyrean, she was constantly watched by her two fingers, celestial entities that served as intermediaries for the greater will. Every aspect of her future was planned, her role in the cosmic order predetermined. She was to be a vessel, a conduit for divine will rather than an individual with her own desires and aspirations. Her thoughts, her choices, her very body would cease to belong to her the moment she ascended to godhood. Imagine growing up knowing that your future had been decided before your birth, that no matter what you wanted or dreamed of, you were destined to become a puppet for cosmic forces that cared nothing for your individual desires. Every achievement, every moment of personal growth would ultimately be subsumed into this predetermined role. You would never be allowed to simply be yourself. You would always be in training to become something else, something that would erase everything that made you uniquely you. This realization drove Ranni to orchestrate perhaps the most complex and far-reaching act of rebellion in the history of the lands between, the Night of Black Knives. Her plan required not just the death of her own physical body but the sacrifice of an innocent soul, her stepbrother Godwyn. The moral weight of this decision cannot be understated. Ranni chose to murder a beloved family member to secure her own freedom. She knew that Godwyn was innocent, that he did not deserve his fate. Yet she proceeded anyway because the alternative eternal servitude was to her utterly unacceptable. The theft of the Rune of Death from Malekith, the Black Blade, was itself a monumental undertaking, requiring her to outmaneuver one of the most powerful entities in the lands between. The creation of the Black Knife Assassins, all Numen women with connections to Queen Marika herself, suggests a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the Golden Order. The precision required to split the curse mark of death between herself and Godwyn speaks to magical knowledge of the highest order. Yet even as Ranni succeeded in her immediate goal of freeing herself from the greater will's influence, the cost of her actions echoed through the ages. Godwyn's corruption spread throughout the lands between, creating countless undead and perverting the natural order of death itself. The shattering that followed would claim countless lives, and reduce a prosperous realm to ruins. Ranni had chosen personal freedom over collective well-being, a decision that speaks to both her tremendous strength of will and her moral limitations. The question that haunts Ranni's story is whether the freedom of one individual, however noble or potentially beneficial that individual might be, can justify the suffering imposed on countless innocents. Ranni would likely argue that she is working toward a greater good, an age of stars where all beings would be freed from the tyranny of outer gods. But the path to that freedom is paved with corpses, beginning with Godwyn's spiritual death and extending through all the chaos of the Shattering. After achieving her spiritual freedom, Ranni faced the challenge of existing as a disembodied soul in a world that expected her to have physical form. Her solution was to inhabit a series of dolls crafted in her image, but this existence came with its own constraints. She could interact with the world only in limited ways, dependent on the cooperation of others to achieve her goals, forever reminded of what she had sacrificed to gain her freedom. The irony of Ranni's situation is profound. In rejecting one form of servitude to the greater will, she may have simply chosen another form of imprisonment. Her existence as a doll, however freely chosen, is still a form of death. She cannot feel physical sensations, cannot age or grow, cannot experience the full range of embodied existence. She traded the prison of predetermined divinity for the prison of disembodied consciousness inhabiting artificial forms. Her quest to establish an age of stars, where the influence of outer gods would be removed from the world, entirely requires her to become a god herself, the very role she initially rejected. The difference, she would argue, is that she would be a distant god, one who removes the certainty of divine influence rather than imposing it. Yet the question remains whether this represents wisdom gained through experience, or simply the inescapable nature of power in the cosmic order. Her relationships with others became colored by her fundamental isolation. As a being who had literally killed to avoid the constraints of destiny, Ranni found it difficult to form genuine connections with others. Her interactions with the Tarnished, while ultimately beneficial to both parties, are marked by manipulation and careful calculation rather than spontaneous trust or affection. She had gained the freedom to choose her own path, but lost the simple ability to be vulnerable with others. The followers who serve Ranni Blad the half-wolf, e.g. the troll blacksmith, and others demonstrate profound loyalty to her cause, but their fates reveal the cost of serving someone who has chosen such a radical path. Blad is eventually driven mad by the conflict between his created purpose to serve the Two Fingers and his genuine love for Ranni. Aegi is left to mourn his friends and protect a mistress who can no longer truly connect with him. Their devotion is real, but it cannot bridge the fundamental gulf that Ranni's choice has created. The tragic aspect of Ranni's story lies not in any particular failure or doom, but in the fact that her very success required her to become something less than fully alive. In choosing freedom over servitude, she chose isolation over connection, possibility over certainty. Whether this trade was ultimately worthwhile depends on one's perspective on the value of individual autonomy versus collective belonging. Her ending, should the Tarnished choose to support her quest, shows her ascending to godhood, but immediately departing on a journey into the dark spaces between stars, taking the Tarnished with her. It is a form of victory, perhaps, but it is also a form of exile, removing herself and her influence so completely that she might as well not exist as far as the lands between are concerned. She achieves freedom from cosmic interference by absenting herself entirely from the cosmic order. Starscourge Radahn presents the tragedy of a hero whose very virtues became the instruments of his destruction. The second child of Radahn and Rennala, Radahn embodied the warrior ideals of his time, growing to become one of the mightiest demigods in both physical strength and magical prowess. His mastery of gravity magic allowed him to continue riding his beloved steed Leonard, even as he grew to enormous size, a touching detail that speaks to his fundamental kindness and loyalty to those he cared about. Radahn's early life was marked by admiration for Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, whose example inspired him to pursue excellence in warfare and leadership. This admiration was not mere hero worship, but represented a genuine attempt to embody the virtues of honor, strength, and protection of the innocent that Godfrey had exemplified during his reign. Radahn's red mane and lion-like bearing consciously echoed his hero's appearance, marking him as a spiritual successor to the greatest warrior of the previous generation. The general's legendary battle against the falling stars represents the pinnacle of his power and the beginning of his doom. Using his gravity magic, Radahn literally fought against cosmic forces, holding back the stars themselves to protect the lands between from whatever catastrophe their descent might bring. This feat required not just immense power but constant vigilance. The stars remained suspended only as long as Radahn maintained his magical grip upon them. This act of cosmic heroism came with a terrible price. The constant strain of holding back the stars began to consume Radahn from within, requiring more and more of his energy and attention. He became locked in an eternal battle against forces that would resume their destructive course the moment his concentration faltered. In protecting the world from cosmic catastrophe, he had sentenced himself to a form of eternal vigilance that would ultimately contribute to breaking his mind. The festivals of combat that Radahn organized before the Shattering represented his attempt to find meaning and purpose despite his burden. These grand tournaments allowed him to test his skills against worthy opponents while providing entertainment and inspiration to his people. The festivals became symbols of Radahn's leadership style. He led not through fear or manipulation, but through example, showing others what heights of achievement were possible through dedication and training. When the Shattering began and the Demigods went to war over the fragments of the Elden Ring, Radahn found himself facing impossible choices. His sister Ranni had orchestrated the events that led to the conflict, yet he could not bring himself to oppose her directly. His military genius and personal power made him a natural leader in any conflict, yet he had no personal ambition for the throne that drove others to terrible extremes. The battle between Radahn and Malenia in the Kelid Wilds represents one of the most tragic encounters in the entire Shattering War. These two demigods, both paragons of their respective virtues, met in single combat that neither truly wanted. Radahn fought with all his skill and might, but Malenia possessed a weapon he could not counter, the scarlet rot that consumed her from within. When Malenia unleashed the bloom of Aeonia, transforming the entire region of Kelid into a corrupted wasteland, she did not do so out of malice but out of desperation. The rot that plagued her body had been held in check through sheer force of will, but the strain of her battle with Radahn finally overwhelmed her defenses. In that moment, she became something she had always fought against, a vector for the very corruption she had spent her life resisting. The scarlet rot that consumed Radahn did not kill him immediately, but rather robbed him of everything that made him who he was. His mighty intellect, capable of calculating the movements of celestial bodies and coordinating massive armies, crumbled under the influence of the cosmic plague. His memories of love and duty faded, leaving behind only base instincts and endless hunger. The noble general became a rabid beast, roaming the wastes of Kelid in search of anything that might satisfy his corrupted appetites. Yet even in his madness, traces of Radahn's former nobility remained. He continued to hold back the stars, his commitment to protecting the world so fundamental that it survived even the destruction of his conscious mind. His horse Leonard, though reduced to little more than skin and bones by years without proper care, was still tenderly cared for by the maddened general. He had learned gravity magic partly to continue riding his beloved companion, and even in his degraded state, he refused to abandon Leonard. These small gestures of continuity made his fall all the more heartbreaking, showing glimpses of the hero he had been through the monster he had become. Soldiers who encountered the corrupted Radahn reported that sometimes, in certain lights or circumstances, they could see flashes of his former bearing, a moment of tactical brilliance in how he positioned himself, a hesitation before attacking that suggested some fragment of honor remained. The Festival of Radahn, organized by his remaining loyal followers after his corruption, represents perhaps the most tragic celebration in all of fiction. These warriors and scholars who had served under Radahn in his glory days chose to honor their general's memory by arranging for his death at the hands of worthy opponents. They understood that the being rampaging through Kelid was no longer their beloved leader, but could not bring themselves to simply abandon him to his corruption. When mighty warriors gathered to participate in the festival, they did so not out of bloodlust or desire for glory, but out of respect for what Radahn had been and compassion for what he had become. The festival represented a form of mercy killing, a final gift to a hero who had given everything in service to others and deserved better than to spend eternity as a mindless beast, consuming the corpses of his own soldiers in the wastelands. Jeren, Radahn's friend and festival organizer, carries perhaps the heaviest burden. He must invite warriors to kill his general, must watch as they battle the corrupted remains of a hero he served alongside, must maintain the facade that this is a celebration rather than an execution. His pain is written in every interaction, every carefully chosen word meant to honor Radahn, while acknowledging the terrible reality of what must be done. The irony of Radahn's fate is that his very virtues, his strength, his dedication, his refusal to abandon his responsibilities even when they consumed him made his fall inevitable. A lesser being might have found some way to compromise, to share the burden of holding back the stars, or to accept help from others. But Radahn's heroic pride and genuine love for the world made him unable to consider any solution that might put others at risk. When the Tarnished and other warriors finally bring Radahn down during the festival, it is both victory and tragedy. The stars he had held back for so long finally resume their courses, bringing whatever fate they carry with them. But the noble general is finally freed from his burden of pain and madness, allowed to rest after a lifetime of service and years of suffering. His death is simultaneously defeat and release, the end of a nightmare that had consumed one of the realm's greatest heroes. The aftermath of Radahn's death shows his soldiers weeping openly, not in shame that their general was defeated, but in relief that his suffering has finally ended. They had watched him degrade for years, had been forced to avoid him or fight him when he attacked in his madness, had lived with the knowledge that the hero they loved was trapped in a prison of corrupted flesh and broken mind. His death freed them almost as much as it freed him. Praetor Rykard, the youngest of Ranni's children, followed a path that led from noble ideals to monstrous corruption, representing perhaps the clearest example of how good intentions can lead to ultimate damnation. Rykard began his career as a praetor of the Golden Order, a position that required both legal expertise and moral authority. He was tasked with upholding the laws and principles that govern the lands between, a role that should have placed him firmly on the side of justice and order. Yet Rykard's intimate knowledge of the law revealed to him its fundamental hypocrisies and limitations. He saw how the Golden Order's high-minded principles were applied selectively, how justice was often subordinated to political expediency, and how the system he served ultimately protected the interests of the powerful at the expense of the weak. Every case he adjudicated, every law he enforced, revealed new layers of corruption and inequality built into the very foundations of the order he had sworn to uphold. This disillusionment set him on a path toward increasingly radical solutions to the problems he observed. His involvement in the Night of Black Knives conspiracy, though secondary to his sister Ranni's role, marked his first major break with the established order. By providing logistical support and protection for the operation, Rykard demonstrated his willingness to work outside the law he had sworn to uphold. This decision, perhaps made with the best of intentions, opened a door that could never be closed again. The establishment of Volcano Manor as a refuge for those who opposed the Golden Order reflected Rykard's genuine desire to create an alternative to the system he had come to despise. The manor became a haven for outcasts, rebels, and those who had been wronged by the established order. Here, former knights who had lost faith in their oaths could find new purpose. Scholars whose ideas had been deemed heretical could pursue their research. And common folk who had been crushed by the system could find protection and community. The early days of Volcano Manor represented something genuinely positive, a community built on shared values of questioning authority and seeking justice outside traditional structures. Rykard's legal training served him well in creating fair systems for resolving disputes within the community. His intelligence attracted brilliant minds who contributed to genuine intellectual ferment. For a time, it seemed possible that he might actually create a viable alternative to the Golden Order. Yet even as Rykard built his alternative community, He was drawn toward increasingly extreme measures in his pursuit of the power necessary to challenge the Golden Order directly. His research into blasphemous sorceries led him to make contact with entities and forces that existed outside the cosmic order entirely. These investigations, conducted with the methodical thoroughness of his legal training, gradually wore away at his moral boundaries and sense of proportion. The transformation of Volcano Manor itself reflects Rykard's gradual descent into moral compromise. What began as a scholarly retreat, where dissidents could safely discuss alternative philosophies, slowly became a training ground for assassins and rebels. The manor's libraries, once filled with treatises on law and justice, accumulated forbidden texts on dark magic and the summoning of entities from beyond the stars. The recusant organization that Rykard established marked his formal break with any pretense of working within existing systems. These assassins, recruited from among his most devoted followers, were tasked with eliminating key figures who supported the Golden Order's continued dominance. Each successful assassination was both a victory for Rykard's cause and a step further away from the legal principles he had once sworn to uphold. The study of forbidden magics opened doorways in Rykard's mind that could never be closed again. Each new spell mastered, each new entity contacted, expanded his understanding of the cosmic forces that shaped reality, while simultaneously corrupting his perspective on right and wrong. The knowledge he gained came with its own hunger, demanding ever greater sacrifices and more terrible risks to achieve meaningful power. The installation of the God-Devouring Serpent within Volcano Manor marked the point of no return in Rykard's transformation. This ancient entity, capable of literally consuming divine essence, represented power of a scale that could genuinely challenge the cosmic order itself. Yet its very presence within his stronghold began to influence everyone who came into contact with it, gradually converting his community of idealistic rebels into a cult centered around feeding the serpent's endless appetite. The corruption was subtle at first, manifesting as increased tolerance for violence, growing appetite for conflict, and gradual shift in priorities from protecting the innocent to simply opposing authority. Members of the community who had joined to fight for justice found themselves participating in acts of increasing brutality, each justified as necessary for the greater cause but collectively representing a fundamental betrayal of their original values. Rykard's own relationship with the serpent began as that of a scholar studying a fascinating specimen, but gradually evolved into something approaching worship. The entity's vast knowledge of cosmic forces and its complete disregard for conventional morality offered him perspectives that his legal training could never have provided. Yet each conversation with the creature left him a little less human, a little more willing to consider solutions that his former self would have found abhorrent. The philosophical corruption preceded the physical transformation by years. Long before Rykard offered his body to the serpent, his mind had already been consumed by its alien logic. He had come to believe that the only way to truly change the world was to destroy it completely and rebuild it according to principles derived from entities that existed outside the current cosmic order entirely. The final ritual in which Rykard allowed himself to be devoured by the God-Devouring Serpent was not an act of desperation, but the culmination of a long philosophical journey. He had convinced himself that by merging with the entity, he could retain his intelligence and moral purpose, while gaining the power necessary to reshape reality itself. The tragedy was not that he was wrong about gaining power, but that he had fundamentally misunderstood what that power would cost him. The being that emerged from this merger retained Rykard's memories and intelligence, but had lost the capacity for the compassion and justice that had originally motivated his rebellion. The God-Devouring Serpent's influence was not limited to granting power, it fundamentally altered the priorities and perspectives of anything that merged with it. Rykard's noble goals of creating a more just world were replaced by the serpent's simple desire to consume everything that existed. The physical transformation was horrifying in its completeness. Rykard's human form was not simply destroyed but integrated into the serpent's massive body, creating a chimeric being that was neither fully human nor fully serpent. His face, still recognizable but twisted into something alien and terrible, emerged from the creature's body like a grotesque ornament, retaining the power of speech but using it only to express the serpent's hunger for destruction. His invitation to those who challenge him join the Serpent King as family, reveals how completely his understanding of community and connection has been perverted. What he offers is not family in any meaningful sense, but absorption into a collective hunger, the erasure of individual identity in service to endless consumption. The idealistic praetor who once sought to protect the oppressed now seeks to devour all who approach. Tanith's response to Rykard's transformation reveals the depth of psychological manipulation that the serpent's influence achieved. Rather than being repulsed by what her consort had become, she embraced it as the fulfillment of his destiny, organizing the remaining members of Volcano Manor around the goal of feeding the serpent god and expanding its influence. Her devotion, once directed toward a man with noble goals, became redirected toward a monster whose only purpose was consumption. When the Tarnished finally defeats the serpent god that was once Rykard, Tanith is found consuming his remains, literally trying to take him into herself, as he had taken the serpent into himself. It is a grotesque mirror of devotion, love transformed into a form of cannibalistic possession. The tragedy of Volcano Manor is complete. Every noble ideal has been inverted, every relationship corrupted, every hope transformed into horror. The twin prodigies, Miquella and Malenia, represent perhaps the most heartbreaking tragedy in all of Elden Ring's lore. Born of the union between Queen Marika and Radahn, who were revealed to be two aspects of the same divine being, these children inherited not just immense power but terrible curses that would define their entire existence. Their story is one of love, sacrifice, and the gradual corruption of the purest intentions by forces beyond their control. Miquella, the elder of the twins despite his eternally youthful appearance, was cursed with nascency, doomed to remain forever in the body of a child regardless of how much time passed or wisdom he gained. This curse was not merely physical but spiritual, preventing him from growing into his full power as an Empyrean and limiting his ability to interact with the world as an adult. Yet rather than allowing this limitation to embitter him, Miquella channeled his frustration into an obsessive desire to help others, particularly his beloved twin sister. Malenia's curse was even more visible and destructive. From birth, she was afflicted with scarlet rot, a cosmic plague that slowly consumed her body from within. Over time, the rot claimed her eyes, leaving her blind, and forced the amputation of limbs that had become too corrupted to function. These lost parts were replaced with prosthetics of unalloyed gold, Miquella's own invention, designed to resist the influence of outer gods and slow the progression of her disease. The relationship between the twins transcended normal sibling bonds, becoming a partnership forged in mutual understanding of suffering and shared determination to overcome their respective curses. Miquella dedicated his considerable intellect and magical abilities to finding cures for both their conditions, while Malenia served as his protector and champion, wielding her sword in defense of his research and ideals. Imagine the childhood of these two born to divinity, but marked by suffering from their first moments. While other children played, Miquella studied curses and divine afflictions, seeking solutions to problems that had stumped the greatest minds of previous ages. While other children learned normal lessons, Malenia trained in swordsmanship, developing fighting techniques that would work despite her progressive blindness and loss of limbs. They had each other, but they also had the constant awareness that time was their enemy, that every day brought new progression of their curses. Miquella's rejection of Golden Order fundamentalism came when he realized that its rigid doctrines offered no hope for beings like himself and his sister. The established religious and magical practices of the realm were designed for beings who fit neatly into predetermined categories, not for cursed Empyreans whose very existence challenged the Order's claims of perfection and divine favor. This rejection led Miquella to develop entirely new forms of magic and technology. The creation of unalloyed gold, a substance that could resist the influence of outer gods, represented a breakthrough of immense significance. The unalloyed gold needles he crafted gave Malenia some relief from her rot's progression, though they could never fully cure her condition. They were symbols of his love made manifest. He could not save her completely, but he could give her moments of peace, brief respites from the constant pain. The creation of the Haligtree represents Miquella's most ambitious attempt to solve their problems through his own power rather than relying on existing systems. Using his own divine blood as sustenance, he nurtured a sapling that grew into a massive tree intended to rival the Erd tree itself. This new tree would serve as a sanctuary for all those rejected by the Golden Order, the Omen, the Misbegotten, the Albinaurics, and any others deemed unworthy by the established powers. The Haligtree became more than just a refuge. It was a statement of principles. Under its branches, beings were valued not for their adherence to arbitrary standards of purity, but for their inherent worth as living creatures. The community that grew around the tree reflected Miquella's vision of a more inclusive and compassionate order, one that could embrace diversity rather than demanding conformity. Malenia's role as Miquella's protector placed her in an impossible position during the Shattering. When various demigods began fighting over the fragments of the Elden Ring, she faced the choice between remaining by her brother's side and actively working to secure the power he would need to realize his vision. Her decision to take up arms and lead military campaigns in support of Miquella's cause spoke to both her devotion and her recognition that passive protection would not be enough. The Cleanrot Knights who served Malenia demonstrated their own form of tragic devotion. These warriors, drawn from the finest soldiers of their generation, willingly accepted infection with her scarlet rot rather than abandon their mistress in her time of need. Their transformation from proud knights into plague-bearers was not the result of any failing on their part, but simply the inevitable consequence of loving someone who carried cosmic destruction within her very being. The Battle of Aeonia against Radahn represents the culmination of Malenia's internal struggle between her desire to protect others and the destructive power she carried within herself. Throughout her life, she had fought against the Scarlet Rot's influence, refusing to allow it to define her or limit her choices. She had never bloomed, never unleashed the full power of her curse, maintaining absolute control through sheer force of will. Yet when faced with an opponent she could not defeat through skill alone, when Radahn's strength proved equal to hers, when the stalemate threatened to consume both armies, she made the terrible choice to unleash the very corruption she had spent her life containing. The blooming of Aeonia transformed the entire region of Caelid into a rotting wasteland, demonstrating the true scope of the destruction Malenia had been holding back through decades of constant vigilance. The physical process of blooming was agony beyond description. The rot that Malenia had fought against for her entire life suddenly erupted from every pore, transforming her body into a living weapon of mass destruction. She became, for those moments, exactly what she had always feared becoming, not a person but a plague, not a protector but a destroyer. The psychological trauma of this experience, of losing control so completely, of becoming the very thing she had dedicated her life to resisting, was immense. When she emerged from the bloom, having defeated Radahn but destroyed an entire region in the process, Malenia fell into a coma. The physical exhaustion certainly played a role, but perhaps more significant was the psychological weight of what she had done. She had unleashed devastation on a scale that would echo for generations, had condemned countless innocents to death by rot, had transformed a thriving region into a hellscape. The guilt of this, combined with the trauma of losing control, may have proved too much for even her iron will to bear while conscious. Cleanrot Knight Finlay's journey to carry the unconscious Malenia back to the Haligtree stands as perhaps one of the greatest acts of devotion in the entire Shattering War. Alone, infected with rot, carrying a burden nearly as heavy as herself, she traversed the dangerous wastes of Caelid, while fighting off constant attacks from the creatures that now populated the corrupted landscape. Every step would have been agony, every moment a battle against her own failing body and the enemies that surrounded her. Her success in this seemingly impossible task speaks to the extraordinary dedication that love can inspire even in a dying body. Yet even Finlay's triumph carried its own tragedy. She delivered her mistress safely to the Haligtree, only to discover that the very brother Malenia had fought to protect was gone kidnapped by Mohg while she had been away. Her greatest achievement had come too late to prevent this loss. Her sacrifice, while heroic, could not change the outcome. Malenia's vigil at the base of the Haligtree, waiting for a brother who would never return, represents one of the most poignant images in all of gaming. Here was a warrior who had conquered armies and laid waste to entire regions, reduced to simply waiting and hoping for the return of the one person who gave her life meaning. Her faith in Miquella's eventual return never wavered, even as the Halig tree began to decay around her, and the community they had built together started to crumble. She sits in her throne, blind eyes staring at nothing, her prosthetic limbs still and silent, waiting. How many days did she wait? How many weeks, months, perhaps years, sitting in that same position, hoping that today would be the day her brother returned? The rot continued its slow progression through her body even as she waited. The clean-rot knights who had followed her grew weaker, their bodies failing as the corruption claimed them piece by piece. The Halig tree itself began to show signs of decay without Miquella's blood to sustain it. Yet Malenia never moved from her post. She had failed to protect Miquella when it mattered most. She would not fail to be there when he returned. This is the tragedy of Malenia. Not that she was defeated in battle, not that she unleashed the rot, but that her absolute devotion to her brother led her to spend what might have been years in futile waiting, unable to move forward, unable to accept that he might not return, trapped by her own love. The revelation from Shadow of the Erd Tree that Miquella had deliberately abandoned his love and compassion in his quest for godhood adds another layer of tragedy to their story. The brother for whom Malenia had sacrificed everything had chosen to discard the very qualities that had made their relationship special. In pursuing the power to create a better world, Miquella had made himself incapable of the love that had originally motivated his quest. This means that even if Miquella were to return to the Halig tree, he would no longer be the brother Malenia remembered. The being she waited for so faithfully may have ceased to exist in the way she knew him, replaced by something that might wear his face, but could no longer feel the compassion that had once driven him to help her bear her curse. Her vigil was not just futile but fundamentally impossible. She was waiting for someone who might no longer exist in the form she remembered, hoping for a reunion that could never truly happen, even if Miquella physically returned. The tragedy of the twins is that their love for each other, which should have been their greatest strength, became the instrument of their destruction. Miquella's desire to cure Malenia drove him to increasingly extreme measures, eventually leading him to abandon the very compassion that had made that desire meaningful. Malenia's devotion to Miquella drove her to unleash destruction on a massive scale, and then to waste away in futile waiting, her formidable abilities unused, her potential unfulfilled. They represented perhaps the greatest hope for the lands between two beings of immense power and noble intentions working together to create something genuinely better. Yet their very nobility, their very love, became the weapons used against them. The curses they bore were terrible, but perhaps the greater curse was the way those afflictions twisted their best qualities into sources of suffering and failure. From the land of shadow, we learn of Messmer the Impaler, another of Marika's children, whose story reveals the lengths to which a divine mother would go to hide her shame and protect her reputation. Messmer represents the demigod that the Golden Order tried to erase from history, whose very existence challenged the narrative of divine perfection that Marika sought to maintain. Born with an abyssal serpent dwelling within him, Messmer was marked from birth as something that the Golden Order could not accept or explain. The presence of this internal entity, possibly connected to ancient forces that predated the current cosmic order, made him a living contradiction to the Golden Order's claims of divine purity and perfect governance. He was proof that even the goddess's own children could be touched by forces outside her control, that her perfection was not absolute. Queen Marika's response to her son's condition reveals the depths of her political pragmatism and personal callousness. Rather than seeking to understand or heal Messmer's condition, she chose to hide it. She plucked out one of his eyes and replaced it with a seal of grace designed to suppress the serpent's influence. This brutal modification served not to cure her son, but merely to make his condition less visible, treating the symptom rather than addressing the underlying cause. Imagine the experience of a child undergoing such a procedure. The physical pain would be immense, but worse would be the psychological message it sent. That something about you is so wrong, so shameful, that it requires being literally carved out and suppressed. That your mother values you so little that she would rather mutilate you than accept you as you are. That your very existence is a problem to be managed rather than a life to be cherished. The decision to exile Messmer to the land of shadow represents Marika's ultimate abandonment of maternal duty in favor of political necessity. Unable to reconcile his existence with the image she wished to project, she sent him away to wage a crusade against the Hornsent, the people who, based on what we can piece together, had once threatened her own rise to power. This exile served the dual purpose of removing an embarrassing reminder of imperfection while striking a blow against old enemies. Messmer's crusade in the Land of Shadow was presented as a holy war, a righteous campaign to spread the light of grace to those who dwelt in darkness. In reality, it appears to have been a war of revenge and genocide designed to eliminate the Hornsent culture that had once persecuted Marika's people. The irony was not lost on those who understood the history. They were committing the same acts of cultural destruction that had once been inflicted upon their queen's homeland. The psychological impact of this abandonment on Messmer cannot be overstated. Here was a child who had already suffered the trauma of having a foreign entity dwelling within his body, who had been subjected to painful surgical modification, and who was then exiled from everything he had ever known. His mother's message was clear. His existence was a problem to be managed rather than a life to be cherished. Yet despite this treatment, Messmer retained a tragic loyalty to his mother and her cause. His crusade in the Land of Shadow was conducted with thoroughness and efficiency, demonstrating both his military competence and his desperate desire to prove himself worthy of the love that had been withheld from him. Each victory was an attempt to earn the recognition and acceptance that should have been his birthright. The establishment of his own cult of personality among his followers speaks to Messmer's need to find some form of family and belonging in his exile. The soldiers and knights who served under him became the closest thing he had to a real community, bound together by their shared isolation from the homeland they served. Yet even these relationships were colored by the fundamental inequality between a demigod and mortals, preventing the genuine connection he desperately needed. Messmer's continued maintenance of statues and images of Marika in his domain, carefully preserved while other monuments crumbled, reveals the depth of his enduring hope for reconciliation. Despite everything she had done to him, he continued to believe that somehow, someday, his mother might acknowledge him and welcome him home. This faith in what seems like an impossible redemption made his isolation all the more painful. The Black Knights who serve Messmer represent their own form of tragedy. These warriors chose to follow their lord into exile, abandoning their homes and families to serve a demigod who had been cast aside. Their loyalty is absolute, but it is loyalty to a cause that has no hope of victory, to a leader who seeks acceptance from someone who will never grant it. They fight and die in a foreign land for a queen who does not acknowledge their existence. The serpent within Messmer, rather than being simply a curse to be suppressed, might have represented a connection to powers and wisdom that predated the Golden Order's dominance. By forcing him to deny this aspect of his nature, Marika may have prevented him from accessing knowledge and abilities that could have benefited both him and the realm he served. His seal of grace, meant to protect him, might actually have been a prison preventing his full potential. The tragic irony of Messmer's story is that his very qualities, his strength, his loyalty, his willingness to bear any burden for his mother's approval, made him the perfect tool for Marika's political machinations. A son who demanded recognition and love might have caused problems, might have revealed himself and forced Marika to acknowledge her imperfection. A son who desperately sought approval could be manipulated indefinitely, sent away to fight wars that served his mother's interests, while never receiving the acceptance he craved. His ultimate fate, should the tarnished venture to the Land of Shadow and face him, shows him still fighting, still serving, still hoping that his service might somehow earn him the love he had always been denied. He speaks of his mother with reverence and devotion, defending her legacy even as he himself has been erased from that legacy. He never learned that no amount of service or sacrifice could earn what should have been freely given from the moment of his birth. Messmer's story represents a particular form of parental cruelty, not outright hatred or abuse, but conditional love that can never actually be satisfied. Marika gave him just enough hope to keep him loyal, just enough acknowledgement to keep him serving, but never the full acceptance that would have freed him from his desperate need for her approval. She used his love as a weapon against him, ensuring that he would remain useful, while never allowing him to be truly seen or valued. The shattering itself represents the culmination of all these individual tragedies, The moment when personal pain became cosmic catastrophe. This war was not simply a political conflict over succession, but a manifestation of the deep psychological wounds that had been inflicted upon an entire generation of divine-blooded beings. Understanding the shattering requires understanding that it was, fundamentally, a family fighting out generations of trauma on a scale that destroyed their entire world. The shattering began not with the breaking of the Elden Ring, but with the breaking of family bonds that should have united Queen Marika's children. The assassination of Godwyn shattered whatever trust might have existed between the demigods. If a beloved stepbrother could be murdered by one of their own, what safety could any of them expect from the others? If the goddess herself would shatter the Elden Ring in her grief, what stability could possibly remain? Each demigod entered the conflict carrying the weight of their own personal tragedies, their own curses and disappointments, their own desperate need for validation and meaning. The war became not just a struggle for political power, but a forum for working out generations of accumulated family trauma on a cosmic scale. When Malenia fought Radahn, she was not just fighting for territory or great runes. She was fighting to prove that she could protect Miquella despite her curse. When Morgott defended Leyndell, he was not just protecting a city, he was proving his worth to an order that had rejected him. The irony of the shattering is that it was triggered by an act of maternal grief. When Queen Marika shattered the Elden Ring following Godwyn's assassination, she was acting not as a calculating politician, but as a mother whose heart had been broken by the loss of her most beloved child. Yet this expression of maternal anguish created the very conditions that would lead to the destruction of everything she had worked to build. The distribution of the great runes among her surviving children represented both an opportunity and a curse. Each fragment of the shattered Elden Ring carried immense power, enough to transform its bearer into something approaching a god. Yet that same power came with a terrible price. It amplified every existing flaw and obsession in its wielder, turning personal struggles into cosmic catastrophes. Godrick's possession of a great rune transformed his feelings of inadequacy into a desperate need to literally remake himself through grafting. The power should have been enough to make him a formidable leader, but instead it became fuel for his self-destructive attempts to become something he was never meant to be. Radahn's great rune amplified his heroic nature, but also his burden, making the strain of holding back the stars even more crushing. Rykard's great rune provided him with the influence necessary to build his community at Volcano Manor, but it also made the God-Devouring Serpent's whispers more seductive, accelerating his journey toward damnation by giving him the confidence to believe he could control forces beyond his understanding. Malenia's great rune gave her the strength to become an unparalleled warrior, but it also made her scarlet rot more virulent and harder to control. The war that followed was not a conventional conflict between rational actors pursuing clear political goals, but a manifestation of collective mental illness on a cosmic scale. Each demigod fought not just for the throne but for validation of their own worth, for proof that their suffering had meaning, for the chance to reshape the world according to their own traumatized understanding of what order should look like. The battles of the Shattering were marked by a level of brutality and destruction that went far beyond what would have been necessary for mere political victory. Entire regions were laid waste, not because they held strategic value, but because the demigods' psychological wounds demanded total destruction of anything that reminded them of their pain. The transformation of Caelid, the corruption spreading from Godwyn's remains, the blood-soaked dungeons of Mohgwyn Palace. These were not calculated military strategies, but symptoms of psychological damage manifesting as physical destruction. The involvement of external forces in the conflict, the various outer gods, the greater will's withdrawal of support, the machinations of entities like the Formless Mother, transformed what had begun as a family dispute into a cosmic conflict, with implications far beyond the lands between itself. The demigods became proxies in struggles between forces they barely understood, their personal pain weaponized by entities whose goals had nothing to do with their well-being. The siege of Leyndell saw brother fighting brother, with Morgott defending the capital against his own siblings not out of personal animosity, but out of his pathological need to prove his worth to a system that had never valued him. The sight of the Omen King, standing alone against multiple demigod armies, speaks to both his incredible dedication and his tragic inability to see that his loyalty was misplaced. The gradual exhaustion of all sides in the conflict created a stalemate that was perhaps worse than outright victory by any single faction would have been. The lands between became a realm where war was constant but inconclusive, where suffering continued indefinitely without the possibility of resolution through victory or defeat. Resources dwindled, populations scattered, and the very infrastructure of civilization crumbled. The common people caught in these conflicts suffered perhaps most of all. They had no great runes to grant them power, no divine blood to protect them, no cosmic significance to justify their pain. They were simply trying to survive in a world where gods fought like children, where entire regions could be destroyed as collateral damage in family disputes, where the very concept of safety and stability had become meaningless. Villages that had stood for generations were abandoned overnight when demigod conflicts made their locations untenable. Trade networks collapsed, leaving communities without access to essential goods. Agricultural regions were devastated, leading to widespread famine. The various factions recruited or conscripted soldiers from these desperate populations, offering food and protection in exchange for participation in wars they didn't understand. The psychological impact on the surviving population was equally devastating. Generations grew up knowing only war, with no memory of the peace and prosperity that had once characterized the lands between under unified rule. The very concept of stable government became alien to people who had lived their entire lives watching divine rulers destroy each other and everything around them. The rise of various cults and alternative belief systems during this period reflects the population's desperate search for meaning in a world where traditional sources of authority had proven themselves unworthy of trust. The worship of outer gods, the embrace of nihilistic philosophies, and the turn toward increasingly extreme forms of religious expression all represent attempts to find spiritual stability in a reality that seemed to have lost all coherent structure. The emergence of those who live in death as a significant presence throughout the lands between was amplified by the psychological and spiritual chaos of the Shattering. The corruption spreading from Godwyn's remains found fertile ground in a world where the boundaries between life and death had become increasingly meaningless. Skeletons rose from graves not just because of deathroot, but because the world itself had lost its ability to maintain natural order. The arrival of the Tarnished represents not a natural evolution of the conflict, but an external intervention by forces that had grown tired of the stalemate. The Greater Will's decision to recall the exiled Tarnished and task them with claiming the Elden Ring was essentially an admission that the demigods had proven themselves incapable of resolving their differences through their own efforts. Yet even this intervention carries its own tragic implications. The Tarnished's quest requires them to kill or defeat the very demigods whose suffering created the crisis in the first place. Victory for the Tarnished means the final destruction of Queen Marika's family, the complete failure of her experiment in creating divine rulers capable of maintaining cosmic order. The various endings available to the Tarnished represent different philosophical approaches to resolving the crisis, but none of them can truly undo the damage that has been done. Whether the player chooses to restore the old order, create a new one, or abandon the concept of cosmic governance entirely, the fundamental tragedy remains. An entire generation of divine beings destroyed themselves and their world in pursuit of love and validation that was never truly available to them. To truly understand the depth of these tragedies, we must examine not only the demigods themselves, but the countless lives that were touched, shaped, and often destroyed by their struggles. Every knight who served them, every scholar who studied under them, every common person who lived in their domains became part of their story, often paying prices they never chose to pay for conflicts they barely understood. The Cleanrot Knights who served Malenia represent perhaps the most poignant example of this collateral tragedy. These warriors, drawn from the finest soldiers of their generation, willingly accepted infection with the Scarlet Rot rather than abandon their mistress in her time of need. Their transformation from proud knights into plague-bearers was not the result of any failing on their part, but simply the inevitable consequence of loving someone who carried cosmic destruction within her very being. The process of becoming a Cleanrot Knight, was not a single moment of infection, but a gradual transformation that could take months or even years to complete. These warriors watched their own bodies slowly succumb to the same corruption that plagued their beloved commander, experiencing firsthand the constant pain and degradation that she had endured since birth. Yet rather than fleeing or seeking cures, they embraced their transformation as a form of communion with her suffering. The psychological impact of this willing corruption cannot be overstated. These knights had to watch their flesh rot away, their limbs become twisted and weak, their very identities subsumed into the spreading plague. Yet they maintained their loyalty and dedication even as they lost everything that had once defined them as human beings. Their armor, crafted from unalloyed gold to slow the rot's progression, became both protection and prison, a constant reminder of what they had sacrificed for love. The relationship between Malenia and her knights transcended normal military hierarchy, becoming something approaching a family bond forged in shared suffering. She understood their pain because it was her own pain, and they understood her burden because they had chosen to bear a portion of it themselves. This mutual understanding created a loyalty that went far beyond duty or honor, becoming something closer to religious devotion. The Cuckoo Knights who served Ranni, during and after her abandonment by Radahn, faced a different but equally heartbreaking situation. These warriors had originally been among the finest in the lands between, their magical abilities and tactical prowess making them formidable opponents. They took pride in their service to the Academy of Rykard and their queen, viewing themselves as guardians of knowledge and wisdom, as well as military might. Radagon's departure created a crisis of identity for these knights that went far beyond simple political upheaval. Their entire worldview had been built around the unity of their royal house and the wisdom of their leaders. When that unity was shattered by Radagon's abandonment, they found themselves serving a queen who could no longer function as a rational leader. Ranni's transformation from brilliant sorceress queen to obsessed guardian of an amber egg represented the complete breakdown of everything the Cuckoo Knights had sworn to protect. The woman they had followed into battle, whose magical innovations had revolutionized their understanding of combat sorcery, had become a figure of pity rather than respect. Yet their oaths bound them to continue serving her regardless of her condition. The psychological impact of watching their beloved queen's deterioration, played out over months and years, created a unique form of trauma for these warriors. They had to maintain the pretense that their service still had meaning, while privately recognizing that their queen was no longer capable of the leadership they desperately needed. This cognitive dissonance created a deep sense of purposelessness that no amount of duty or honor could address. Some of the Cuckoo Knights attempted to maintain the fiction that their service remained meaningful by focusing on protecting the academy itself rather than their queen personally. They threw themselves into defending the institution's accumulated knowledge and maintaining its traditions, hoping that by preserving the framework of their former lives, they could somehow recapture their lost sense of purpose. The followers who gathered around Mohg, Lord of Blood, were drawn not by obvious virtues but by his promise to value those whom society had rejected and forgotten. The blood cult that formed around Mohg attracted beings from across the spectrum of outcasts and misfits omens like himself who had been cast aside by the Golden Order, Albinorics who faced systematic discrimination, former knights who had lost faith in their oaths, and countless others who had found no place in the established order. For these individuals, Mohg's message of blood and rebirth offered something that had been denied to them elsewhere, a sense of belonging and purpose. The transformation rituals that characterized Mohg's cult were both empowering and destructive, offering participants increased power and status within the community, while fundamentally altering their nature in ways that made return to normal society impossible. Those who underwent these rituals found themselves bound to the cult not just by loyalty but by the simple fact that they could no longer exist anywhere else. The blood magic had changed them too fundamentally, marked them too obviously as different. They had traded one form of marginalization for another, perhaps more comfortable but equally limiting. The scholars and students who gathered around Rykard at Volcano Manor before his transformation represent another category of collateral damage in the Demigods' tragedies. These intellectuals were drawn by genuine idealism and a sincere desire to create a more just world, only to find themselves gradually corrupted by the very methods they had hoped to use for positive change. The early days of Volcano Manor's intellectual community were marked by vibrant debates about law, justice, and the nature of legitimate authority. Brilliant minds from across the lands between gathered to discuss alternatives to the Golden Order's rigid hierarchy, producing treatises and theories that might have formed the foundation for genuine reform if circumstances had been different. The transformation of this scholarly community into a training ground for assassins and cultists represents one of the most heartbreaking aspects of Rykard's story. These individuals had joined his cause because they believed in the possibility of change through reason and knowledge, only to find themselves participants in increasingly violent and extreme actions that betrayed every principle they had originally held. The process of corruption was so gradual that many participants failed to recognize it until they had passed the point of no return. Each compromise seemed reasonable in isolation, supporting this assassination because the target was genuinely corrupt, endorsing this violent action because peaceful methods had failed, embracing this forbidden knowledge because it might lead to breakthrough insights. In examining the children born of Queen Marika's various unions, we see reflected the fundamental tensions inherent in attempting to create beings capable of bridging the gap between divine purpose and human need. Each lineage represents a different approach to this impossible task, and each demonstrates the ways in which divine blood can become a curse rather than a blessing. The Golden lineage, born of Marika's union with Godfrey, was intended to embody the pure ideal of divine rule. These children were meant to represent the perfect fusion of cosmic authority and earthly leadership, beings capable of maintaining order through strength tempered by wisdom. Yet the very purity of their conception made them vulnerable to corruption and exploitation by forces that operated outside the moral frameworks they were raised to respect. Godwyn's perfection made him a target for those who sought to disrupt the cosmic order. His nobility and trustworthiness, which should have been sources of strength, became weaknesses that enemies could exploit. The assassination that claimed his soul was successful precisely because he was incapable of imagining that someone would violate the fundamental bonds of family and divine order to achieve political goals. The Omen twins' rejection by the very system they were born to serve reveals the Golden Order's fundamental hypocrisy and its inability to live up to its own stated ideals. Morgott and Mohg were denied the love and acceptance that should have been their birthright, not because of anything they had done, but simply because their appearance challenged the Order's pretense of aesthetic perfection. Godrick's diluted heritage and resulting inadequacy demonstrate the problems inherent in any system that bases legitimacy on bloodline rather than merit. His desperate attempts to literally rebuild himself through grafting represent the logical extreme of a worldview that reduces personal worth to inherited characteristics rather than individual achievement or moral character. The Carian bloodline, born of Radagon's union with Ranni, represents the attempt to bridge the gap between cosmic order and intellectual curiosity. These children inherited both the mystical wisdom of their mother's lunar traditions and the militant purpose of their father's service to the Golden Order. Yet this dual heritage created internal conflicts that none of them could fully resolve. Ranni's rebellion against her destined role as an Empyrean was driven by her inherited intellectual independence, but it required her to sacrifice the human connections that her Carian heritage valued. Her success in freeing herself from cosmic servitude came at the cost of becoming fundamentally isolated from the world she sought to influence. Radahn's attempt to embody the heroic ideals of both his parents led him to take on burdens that no single being should have carried. His dedication to protecting the world through his mastery of gravity magic was admirable, but it ultimately consumed him from within, leaving him vulnerable to the very forces he had dedicated his life to opposing. Rykard's journey from idealistic reformer to cosmic horror represents the dark side of the Carian intellectual tradition. His inherited curiosity and analytical skills, combined with his father's militant purpose, led him to pursue knowledge and power without sufficient consideration of their moral implications. The very qualities that made him an effective legal scholar and political organizer also made him susceptible to corruption by entities whose logic transcended human moral categories. The twin prodigies born of Marika's union with her own other self represent the most ambitious attempt to create perfect divine beings. These children inherited the full power of both aspects of their divine parent, making them theoretically capable of reshaping reality itself according to their will. Yet this very perfection made them targets for cosmic forces that sought to use their power for their own purposes. Miquella's curse of eternal youth prevented him from growing into his full potential as both a leader and a magical researcher. His inability to physically mature created a fundamental disconnect between his intellectual development and his social presence, making it difficult for others to take him seriously as an authority figure, despite his obvious brilliance and good intentions. Malenia's affliction with scarlet rot turned her into a walking weapon of mass destruction, making her very presence a threat to everything and everyone she sought to protect. Her greatest acts of love and loyalty, her willingness to fight for Miquella's cause, became also her greatest failures, as the corruption she carried inevitably spread to innocent bystanders. The pattern that emerges from examining all these stories is one of beings created with tremendous potential, but placed in situations where that potential could never be fully realized. Each demigod possessed qualities that, under different circumstances, could have made them forces for tremendous good in the world. Yet the very system that created them also ensured their destruction. The cosmic forces that shaped the demigods' fates. The outer gods, the greater will, the ancient entities that predated the current order viewed these divine-blooded beings not as individuals deserving of love and respect, but as tools to be used in pursuit of abstract goals. The personal happiness and well-being of the demigods was never a consideration in the cosmic calculus that determined their roles and limitations. Queen Marika's own transformation from a mortal woman into a divine vessel represents the original tragedy that shaped all subsequent events. Her loss of individual identity and human perspective, while granting her cosmic power, also made her incapable of the genuine maternal love that her children desperately needed. Her relationships with her offspring became transactional rather than emotional, focused on their utility rather than their welfare. The Greater Will's decision to withdraw support from the demigods when they failed to meet its expectations reveals the fundamentally exploitative nature of divine authority in the lands between. The cosmic order was never designed to serve the needs of the beings it claimed to govern, but rather to use them as instruments for maintaining stability and control. The fundamental tragedy of the demigods lies not in any particular failure or weakness on their part, but in the impossibility of the situation they were placed in. They were created to be bridges between cosmic order and human need, but the very forces that granted them divine power also made it impossible for them to maintain their humanity. As our journey through the tragic fates of the demigods draws to a close, we must reflect on the patterns that emerge from their stories. Each of these divine-blooded beings began their existence with tremendous potential for good, possessed of power and intelligence that could have transformed the lands between into a paradise of justice and prosperity. Yet in every case, that potential was corrupted or destroyed by forces largely beyond their control. The curses that plagued so many of the demigods, Godwyn's spiritual death, Malenia's scarlet rot, Miquella's eternal youth, Messmer's serpent, were not punishments for personal failings, but cosmic afflictions that shaped their entire existence. These curses forced them into roles and behaviors that often contradicted their true natures, creating internal conflicts that could never be fully resolved. The political pressures of divine rule created additional burdens that mortal rulers never face. The demigods were expected to embody perfection while navigating the competing demands of outer gods, inherited obligations, and personal desires. The cosmic scale of their responsibilities made every decision a matter of potentially world-altering consequence, creating pressure that would crush any normal being. Queen Marika's own tragic example as a mother reveals how the demands of godhood can corrupt even the most basic human relationships. Her ultimatum to her children demanding that they become gods or lords or else face abandonment created a competitive dynamic that poisoned any possibility of genuine family bonds. In trying to ensure her children's greatness, she guaranteed their suffering. The shattering itself can be understood as the inevitable result of placing impossible burdens on beings who, despite their divine blood, retained fundamentally human needs for love, acceptance, and meaning. When those needs went unmet, the resulting psychological damage manifested as the conflicts that tore the realm apart. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the demigods' stories is that many of their failures stemmed from their virtues rather than their vices. Godwyn's trusting nature made him vulnerable to assassination. Malenia's devotion to her brother led her to unleash destruction. Morgott's loyalty blinded him to the flaws in the system he served. Radahn's heroism consumed him from within. The lesson embedded in these tales is not that power corrupts, though it certainly can, but that the very qualities that make someone worthy of power can also make them vulnerable to exploitation and destruction. The demigods were not undone by their weaknesses but by their strengths, twisted into forms that served others' agendas rather than their own well-being. Their stories serve as a meditation on the nature of family, duty, and the price of divinity. They remind us that even gods can suffer, that power without love is meaningless, and that the most tragic fates often befall those who least deserve them. In the end, the demigods of Elden Ring are remembered not for their achievements, but for their pain, their struggles, and their ultimate humanity in the face of cosmic indifference. The empty thrones and ruined palaces, scattered throughout the lands between, stand as monuments to their suffering, reminders that even divine blood offers no protection against the fundamental cruelties of existence. Their legacy is written not in glory but in grief, not in triumph but in the understanding that some burdens are too heavy for any soul to bear, no matter how powerful or noble it might be. The tarnished who walks among these ruins carries the weight of all these stories. Every boss defeated, every quest completed, every ending chosen represents not just a mechanical victory but engagement with these profound tragedies. The game invites us not to celebrate the demigods' failures but to understand them, to recognize the humanity beneath the divine trappings, and to grapple with the question of whether any victory can truly redeem such comprehensive suffering. And so concludes our journey through the tragic fates of Elden Ring's demigods. We've discovered how divine blood became both blessing and curse, how family bonds could be twisted into instruments of destruction, and how the very qualities that made these beings special also ensured their doom. The legacy of Godwyn, Malenia, Miquella, Ranni, Radahn, Rykard, Morgott, Mohg, Messmer, and all the others continues to shape the world they left behind, a testament to both their power and their pain. Next time on Sleep to RPG, we'll explore the outer gods and their influence on the lands between, examining how cosmic forces beyond mortal comprehension shape the fates we've discussed tonight. Until then, sweet dreams, fellow adventurers, and may your rest be unmarked by the curses that plague these divine children. If you enjoyed this journey through Elden Ring's most tragic stories, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Sleep to RPG for more epic lore to help you drift off to peaceful sleep. Your support helps us continue exploring the deep mysteries of gaming's greatest worlds. Before we part, let us spend a few more moments contemplating the deeper philosophical questions raised by the demigods' tragic fates. What do these stories tell us about the nature of power, family, destiny, and the price of divinity? How do they reflect universal human experiences despite their fantastical trappings? At its core, the tragedy of the demigods is a tragedy of expectations impossible to fulfill. Each was born into a role defined by forces beyond their control, given responsibilities they never asked for, and judged by standards that were fundamentally arbitrary. Godwyn was expected to be perfect, and his perfection made him a target. Miquella was expected to grow into his power, but was cursed never to grow at all. Malenia was expected to be a warrior and protector, but carried within her the seeds of mass destruction. These impossible expectations reflect a universal human experience, the weight of parental demands, societal pressures, and inherited obligations that shape our lives from birth. We may not bear great runes or fight with cosmic powers, but we all understand the burden of trying to live up to what others expect of us, of being judged not for who we are, but for who we're supposed to be. The demigods' various responses to their situations mirror the range of human coping mechanisms when faced with impossible demands. Morgott internalized the judgment against him and tried desperately to prove his worth. Mohg rejected the system entirely and built his own alternative, however twisted. Ranni fought for freedom at any cost. Radahn shouldered burdens until they broke him. Rykard sought power through increasingly extreme measures. Each represents a different way of responding to trauma and impossible expectations. The role of family dysfunction in the Demigods' tragedies cannot be overstated. Marika's inability or unwillingness to provide genuine maternal love created wounds that shaped every one of her children's lives. Her transactional approach to relationships, love conditional upon achievement, acceptance dependent on usefulness, poisoned the family dynamics and ensured that her children could never find the emotional support they desperately needed. The siblings' relationships with each other were similarly poisoned by competition, resentment, and the fundamental impossibility of genuine connection when everyone is fighting for scraps of maternal approval. Even the genuinely loving relationship between Miquella and Malenia was ultimately toxic in its codependency, with each defining themselves primarily in relation to the other, rather than as independent individuals. This family dysfunction resonates because it reflects, in exaggerated form, the dynamics of many real families. The competitive sibling relationships, the parental favoritism, the conditional love, the impossible standards. These are not fantasy elements, but heightened versions of experiences many people have lived through. The Demigods' stories validate the pain of those who have experienced family dysfunction, while also serving as cautionary tales about how such patterns can perpetuate across generations. The question of agency versus destiny runs through all the Demigods' stories. Were they truly making choices, or were they simply acting out predetermined roles? Ranni fought desperately for freedom of choice, but her very rebellion was shaped by the constraints she was rebelling against. Morgott chose loyalty, but was his choice truly free when it was built on a lifetime of conditioning and psychological trauma? This philosophical tension reflects the eternal human question of free will. We like to believe we make our own choices, but how much are those choices shaped by our upbringing, our circumstances, our neurological wiring, our place in history? The Demigods, with their cosmic constraints made literal, simply dramatize a question that applies to all conscious beings. The outer gods and cosmic forces in Elden Ring represent the various external pressures that shape our lives without our consent: economic systems, political structures, cultural expectations, historical forces. Like the Demigods, we often find ourselves serving purposes we never agreed to, playing roles in dramas we didn't write, suffering consequences for decisions made by others long before we were born. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that the Demigods' suffering served no redemptive purpose. Unlike tragic heroes in classical literature, who might achieve wisdom through suffering, or whose deaths might bring about positive change, the Demigods simply suffered. Their pain didn't ennoble them or teach them profound truths. It just hurt, and then it destroyed them and everything around them. This absence of redemptive meaning makes their stories more genuinely tragic than many classical tragedies. There is no catharsis, no sense that the suffering was somehow worthwhile or necessary. It simply was a brute fact of existence that offers no comfort or consolation. This reflects a more modern, perhaps more honest understanding of tragedy, that sometimes terrible things happen for no good reason, and no amount of heroism or wisdom can prevent them. The Demigods' inability to escape their fates, despite their tremendous power, speaks to the limits of individual agency in the face of systemic problems. Miquella, despite his genius and divine blood, could not cure his or his sister's curses. Radahn, despite holding back the stars themselves, could not prevent his own corruption. Morgott, despite his strength and dedication, could not earn the acceptance he craved. This limitation reflects the real-world experience of feeling powerless in the face of large-scale problems. We may be intelligent, capable, well-intentioned individuals, but we still find ourselves unable to fix broken systems, unable to escape the consequences of historical injustices, unable to protect those we love from forces beyond our control. The Demigods' divine power simply makes this universal human helplessness more visible and dramatic. The corruption of noble intentions represents another recurring theme in the Demigods' stories. Rykard wanted justice and got consumed by a serpent. Mohg wanted belonging and became a predator. Even Marika's original goal of establishing order became twisted into a tyrannical system that caused immense suffering. This progression from good intentions to terrible outcomes reflects the complexity of real-world ethics and politics. We want to believe that good intentions are enough, that if we just try hard enough and want the right things, we can make the world better. The Demigods' stories remind us that intentions are not enough, that methods matter, that power corrupts, that the road to hell is indeed paved with good intentions. Every revolutionary believes they will be different, that their cause is pure enough to justify any means. History and the lands between are littered with the consequences of such thinking. The question of whether any of the demigods could have chosen differently, could have avoided their fates, remains ambiguous. With the benefit of hindsight and external perspective, we can see where they went wrong, what choices led to their doom. But from within their situations, with their limited information and psychological wounds shaping their perceptions, were better choices actually available to them? This question matters because it determines whether their stories are truly tragic or simply stories of failure. True tragedy requires that the protagonist's doom be somehow inevitable despite their best efforts. If the demigods simply made bad choices that could easily have been avoided, their stories become morality plays about the consequences of poor decision-making. But if their fates were sealed by forces beyond their control, by their curses, their upbringing, their circumstances, then their stories achieve genuine tragic weight. The evidence suggests a combination of both elements. Some demigods made terrible choices that were not inevitable. Rykard's decision to merge with the Serpent, Mohg's kidnapping of Miquella, Ranni's murder of Godwyn. But these choices were made by beings who had been shaped by trauma, limited by curses, and pressured by cosmic forces. The choices were real, but the range of available choices was constrained by factors the demigods never consented to. This reflects the complex reality of human moral responsibility. We make genuine choices, and those choices have real consequences, but we make them from within situations we didn't create, with psychological frameworks we didn't design, under pressures we didn't invite. We are neither wholly free agents nor wholly determined automatons, but something more complicated beings with agency operating within constraints. The demigods' legacy in the lands between consists not of their achievements but of their wounds, the death root spreading from Godwyn's corpse, the scarlet rot-consuming Keylid, the blood-soaked dungeons of Mohgwyn Palace, the decaying Haligtree. Their power was such that even their suffering left permanent marks on the world. This, too, reflects a truth about power, that those with great influence leave impacts whether they intend to or not, that their pain can become other people's suffering, that trauma can be transmitted across populations and generations. The Tarnished's role in this tragic landscape is ambiguous. Are they a force of redemption, finally bringing resolution to centuries of suffering? Or are they simply another agent of violence, killing their way through a broken family and claiming power over the ruins? The game refuses to give a simple answer, leaving players to grapple with the moral weight of their actions. This ambiguity is appropriate because it reflects the complexity of real-world intervention in tragic situations. When we try to help people caught in cycles of trauma and dysfunction, are we genuinely helping or simply imposing our own will? When we break systems that are causing harm, are we creating space for something better or just adding to the destruction? There are no easy answers. In the lands between, or in reality, the various endings available to the Tarnished represent different philosophical approaches to dealing with the aftermath of tragedy. Restoring the old order suggests that stability, however flawed, is preferable to chaos. Creating a new order suggests that radical change is necessary despite its risks. Ranni's ending suggests removing divine interference entirely. The Frenzied Flame ending suggests that existence itself is the problem, and everything should be destroyed. Each ending has its logic, its appeal, its terrible costs. The game trusts players to grapple with these choices without providing clear guidance about which is correct. This moral complexity elevates Elden Ring from a simple power fantasy to a genuine exploration of difficult philosophical questions about power, order, freedom, and the price of change. The Demigods' stories also raise questions about the nature of divinity itself. What does it mean to be a god in the lands between? The answer seems to be used to suffer, to have your will subordinated to cosmic purposes you don't fully understand. The outer gods use their vessels without concern for their well-being. The greater will discards its servants when they no longer serve its purposes. Godhood is not a reward but a burden, not power but servitude. This dark view of divinity contrasts sharply with more traditional religious conceptions of godhood as something to be desired or worshipped. In Elden Ring, gods are not beings to emulate but forces to be feared or escaped. The only happy ending for an Empyrean seems to be Ranni's choice to leave entirely, to remove herself from the cosmic order rather than trying to fix it from within. This perspective resonates with modern skepticism about authority and power structures. We have seen too many leaders, religious, political, corporate, abuse their positions, have witnessed too many institutions betray their stated purposes to maintain naive faith in the benevolence of those in power. The lands between simply makes literal what we have learned metaphorically. That power serves itself, that institutions exist to perpetuate themselves, that those at the top are often servants of something worse than themselves. The question of whether anything good came from the demigods' suffering admits no easy answer. Miquella's research into unalloyed gold provided some relief for Malenia and potentially could help others. Ranni's rebellion opened possibilities for a different kind of order. Morgott's defense of Leyndell preserved something of value, however flawed. Radahn's holding of the stars prevented whatever catastrophe their falling would have caused. But these small goods are vastly outweighed by the costs, the death, destruction, corruption, and suffering that spread from the demigods' conflicts. If we were to calculate some cosmic balance sheet of benefit and harm, the demigods would be deeply in the negative. Their existence caused far more suffering than it alleviated. Their power destroyed far more than it protected. Yet to judge them simply by this calculus would be to miss something essential about tragedy. The point of their stories is not to evaluate whether they achieved net positive outcomes, but to understand how beings with genuine virtues and good intentions could still cause catastrophic harm. It is to grapple with the reality that sometimes the best among us fail catastrophically, that virtue is not enough, that good intentions pave roads to hell. The continuing presence of the demigods' influence in the lands between through those who live in death, through the scarlet rot, through the various factions still fighting in their names reminds us that tragedy does not end cleanly. The effects of trauma ripple outward indefinitely, affecting people and places far removed from the original events. Healing, if it comes at all, takes generations and is never complete. This understanding of trauma's persistence is more psychologically sophisticated than narratives that suggest closure is possible, that wounds can be completely healed, that we can move on from terrible events without carrying scars. The lands between, broken and haunted by its divine family's dysfunction, represents a more honest picture of how communities process collective trauma slowly, incompletely, with suffering that extends far beyond the original victims. In contemplating the demigods' fates, we are invited to reflect on our own relationship with power, family, destiny, and suffering. We may not be divine, but we all navigate expectations we didn't create, suffer from wounds we didn't ask for, and struggle to find meaning in circumstances that often seem designed to break us. The demigods' stories, for all their fantastical elements, speak to these universal human experiences. Perhaps the ultimate lesson of the demigods' tragedies is one of compassion for them, for the people caught in the wake of their conflicts, and for ourselves as we navigate our own impossible situations. Their stories teach us to recognize that people can cause terrible harm while still deserving understanding, that judgment is complicated, that the line between victim and perpetrator is often blurred. This compassionate understanding does not excuse the harm caused but provides context for it, helps us see the humanity behind the monstrous outcomes. Godwyn did not choose to become the Prince of Death. Malenia did not want to spread scarlet rot. Morgott thought he was serving a noble cause. Miquella believed he was working toward a better world. Their failures do not erase their humanity or the genuine pain that drove them toward those failures. As we close our eyes and drift towards sleep, let us carry with us not just the epic battles and cosmic powers of Elden Ring's lore, but these deeper truths about the nature of tragedy, the complexity of moral judgment, and the universal experiences of suffering and striving that connect us all demigods and mortals alike in our shared struggle to find meaning in an often incomprehensible world. The lands between lie quiet now, their wars paused, their tragedies told. The demigods rest, or continue their tormented half-existence, while tarnished rise to claim the throne and shape what comes next. But their stories persist, echoing through ruins and continuing to shape the world they left behind. They remind us that every empire is built on bones, every order is purchased with suffering, and every divine dynasty contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. May your dreams be peaceful, unmarked by the curses and tragedies we've explored tonight. May you find rest that the demigods never knew, and wake to a world where the weight of impossible expectations sits a little lighter on your shoulders. The epic tales of the lands between will be here waiting when you return, ready to guide you once again into sleep with their melancholic beauty and tragic grandeur. Good night, fellow tarnished. May you find the rest that eluded the children of Marika, and may your dreams be free of rot, corruption, and the heavy burden of divine blood. Until next time, sleep well, and remember, in the end, we are all simply trying to survive in a world not built for our happiness, seeking meaning in circumstances we did not choose, loving imperfectly, and suffering the consequences. The demigods were no different, only louder, brighter, and more tragic in their vast scale of both aspiration and failure. Sweet dreams, adventurers. The lands between await your return.